Just realised that this is the same shirt that I wore in the last review, which is a banging shirt, but makes me look a bit cheap, doesn't it? And what does he put on instead? Another movie shirt. Oh, what's that, Sam? Is that a shirt of the film on your wall? Yeah, it is. Because that's how much I friggin' like that film, okay? If you haven't watched it yet, you should have, because I told you to watch it in the last video, so just doing, it's lockdown, you've got plenty of time. Watch a 2.5 hour horror film that's actually a breakup movie. This video, as you can see by the title, is a little bit different and the start of a new series I'm doing on my favourite genre, horror films. Raw horror film, Midsummer horror film. Boyhood, a horror film if, like the main character, you're a child of divorce. Like yours truly. As we can see by the length of my previous videos, I have trouble making my thoughts concise and short and making my video the length that people actually watch. And so I had myself a little idea. Why don't I make very short reviews on my favourite genre and merge those two ideas together to create horror highlights. Alliteration, yay! Snappy, rolls off the tongue, makes you remember it. So yeah, this is going to be a semi-regular segment where I talk about the horror films I've watched recently and give you my thoughts and feelings and recommendations on them. Before people start looking at the films that I review in this series and go, it's not really a horror film, it's not even that scary. The term horror is used loosely and it's a pretty broad genre. So all of these films will have horror aspects, but might not necessarily be horror films. But all three of the films in this first episode are pretty scary and horrible and disgusting and vile. So without further ado, on to the first of 3 films in episode 1 of Horror Highlights. First film I want to talk about is The Nightingale, directed by Jennifer Kent. Jennifer Kent, for those of you who don't know, directed The Babadook, which came out a few years previously. And The Babadook is such a clever and layered horror film, and it was widely celebrated. And it's basically a horror film that examines the difficulties of being a single mother and examines grief at the same time. And it's so visually creative and layered. It made for such a strong directorial debut from Kent. She made The Babadook and then did nothing for like years. And then The Nightingale came out, which she directed and wrote. And so I was so hyped to watch this after really, really enjoying The Babadook, as were many people. The Nightingale explores the colonisation of Tasmania by the British forces. And within that setting, it explores the story of Claire, a servant from Ireland who has been sent over to Tasmania to serve as a servant under the army captain Hawkins, a captain of some of the British troops out there. And Kent is an Australian filmmaker, and so she really wanted to explore the brutality of the colonisation that happened at that time and how poorly it treated women and how poorly it treated the indigenous population at the time. And so this is a really brutal examination of historical events in that area. There's essentially a revenge story, and things happen at the start of this film which are really brutal and just plain disgusting. And it makes for a very grueling but engaging first act, as you're just instantly hooked into how horrifically brutal this world is. Then as the revenge story plays out, you're engaged by how harsh and dark the cinematography is and how good the performances are. Even though people are doing disgusting, abhorrent things throughout the film, it's believable because of how good some of the performances are. There are some really engaging and thrilling pieces in this film due to the brutal violence and how Kent directs this violence in a very unromantic way. It's not an action-packed thriller, but it's gripping because it's gritty and realistic in how violent it is. Kent uses some of her skills as a horror filmmaker in dream sequences in the film where Claire has visions of her traumatizing past. And these sequences are fairly scary, but they're not quite as well crafted or surprising as those in The Babadook. As the story goes on, we get a closer examination of the indigenous population and how they were treated at the time. And Claire sort of recognises the injustices that she suffers are just as brutal as the injustices felt by the indigenous people. And so this film reminded me of 12 Years a Slave in scenes just because it's examining just abhorrent racism and brutality in a very unflinching way. And so it's a very good exercise in filmmaking for examining history in a brutally honest way. And for that reason, the film's very respectable because it's a very moral film. It's showing you something that, as if you're an Australian citizen or a British citizen, you need to understand how the indigenous people and the women at this time were treated. So it's a very respectable piece of filmmaking from that point of view. However, and this is going to sound quite bad, it makes it a quite unpleasant and unenjoyable film. You're educated about how brutal things were back then, but this is quite a long film. It's over 2 hours long, and the film gets to a point where it's showing you one act of brutality after another, and at a certain point the film feels a bit repetitive. Yes, it's still fairly gripping, but you're sort of just clenched waiting for the next awful thing to happen, in the same way you might feel watching an anti-war film. You're just waiting for the next act of horror. And so by the end of the film, it's a bit exhausting and it's not meant to be enjoyed as a film, but sort of outside of this very realistic portrayal of racism, it offers very little because you're just watching one brutal act after the other. And so the film was slightly disappointing because it's just nowhere near as clever or layered or intricate as The Babadook. It's still a very important film because it's showing you something that you need to see, but simply showing me something horrific doesn't necessarily make it a brilliant film, although it does make it an important film. Film number 2, Possessor, which is a bit more of a obvious horror film with sci-fi elements thrown in there. Possessor is a sci-fi horror film that came out last year and is directed by Brandon Cronenberg, the son of David Cronenberg. David Cronenberg, for those of you who don't know, is extremely famous horror film director, and he likes to take sci-fi and body horror elements and explore how technology is basically infringing on our lives in modern society and basically destroying us from the inside out. He's done this through films such as The Fly, Videodrome, and Naked Lunch, all of which are weird, gory, and quite entertaining. And let me tell you, his son has done pretty much the same thing. The apple does not fall far from the tree, as Possessor explores a futuristic world where there is technology to insert your consciousness into another human being's body without their consent and then control that body. And we see how this technology is used for assassinations in the future. So company takes over human body and uses that body to murder someone so that there's no clear motive or intent for the assassination and they can get away scot-free. And this technology is used to attack a big tech company. Um, and so there's a lot of interesting politics going on about control over oneself, and how technology affects that. The film has some really interesting ideas when it comes to this, and how technology is a lot more invasive and controlling of you than you might think. One of my favourite scenes is where we see how advertising is used in this world, and there's a workforce of people hacked into your webcams and watching you and picking out the things in your room, like your curtains or your bedding, and then that company will send you adverts for that style of curtain or bedding that you might like to purchase in the future. So for all of you that put tape over your webcams, you're probably doing the right thing come 20 years in the future. The film's engaging because, as you would expect, things go wrong quite early on, and so then it's very thrilling watching the violence that unfolds as a result of the technology going wrong. And the violence has a lot of visual style to it. It's a very gory film, but also has some more subtle effects, great use of lighting throughout in these sequences where you see the host body being torn between their original consciousness and the consciousness being inserted into them. And so there's some fun sort of visual horror in those scenes. Something I'm a big fan of, and this film does very well, is actors acting. What I mean by that is when an actor has to perform whilst performing. So some of the characters in this film are the body of one character but have to act like the other character because they've got their consciousness in them, and that's done really, really well in this film. I've always loved that sort of acting. Like, one of my favourite performances of last year was Leonardo DiCaprio in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because he's acting as his character, but then he acts on set in the fictitious movie in the film, and I think that's such a interesting style of performance, and it's done really well in this film by the two lead actors. However, I think Possessor falls a bit short towards the end. It's got a lot of interesting ideas it raises about technology and control over the human body, but it doesn't really see any of these ideas through to completion, and instead sort of opts out and goes for sort of stylistic action sequences or stylistic horror sequences. And so, unlike David Cronenberg, his dad's films, there's a lot of exploration of the weird themes and ideas, and it really gets bogged down in those. Whereas this film sort of raised those ideas, but then went, no, we'll just show you a bunch of people getting murdered brutally, and you can think about those ideas yourself. So this is one of Brandon's first films. So in the future, I'd like him to see some of his themes through to fruition a bit more, rather than just raise them and then go for the shock value. And number 3, the final horror film I want to talk about, is House, a Japanese horror film made in 1977. House tells the story of a group of teenage girls who are friends at school, and the summer holidays start, and they decide to run away together to one of their auntie's houses in the countryside. And once they get there, they quickly realise the house and the auntie are haunted, and weird and wonderful things start happening quite soon after they arrive. I think in certain circles, this film's quite well known and discussed. I think a lot of cinephiles will know of this film or have seen clips of it. This film has become very famous for how bad shit crazy it is. This film's bananas, quite literally in some senses. And this film just throws everything at the screen and you don't have a second to breathe, and it's all just quirky and hilarious and weird and hard to put into words. This film basically uses every type of camera shot, editing technique, special effects, sound design to just create a completely assaulting and amazing experience. Every shot in this film is a painting because it's just so inventive and weird and brilliant. It's really hard to sort of describe this film to someone, but it's a film that some people will hate and some people will love because it basically takes every sort of filmic style or filmic technique and goes, I'm going to make the quirkiest, weirdest, most absurdist horror film I can with these. And so, like, nothing's normal about this film. Every edit, every pan of the camera does something odd and bizarre with it. And the film's barely an hour and a half. And so you're literally just being assaulted by creative filmmaking throughout. And so it's a very interesting viewing experience. I've talked about Evil Dead 2 on this channel before, and it's sort of a film that reminds me of that, in that there's very little plot, the characters are paper thin, and the film just is insane, and it just goes, what other weird horror set piece can we do next? And what weird way can we edit or film this sequence which makes it visually creative and engaging? So I have to stress, this film isn't scary at all. This is a comedy. It sort of reminded me of Beetlejuice in a way because it just got that chaotic, frantic energy. The style of humour of this film is you've got to be able to laugh at very over the top and sometimes bad filmmaking. Like, some of the animation in this film is very outdated. The performances are over the top. Everything about this film's over the top. So if you enjoy crazy, outlandish filmmaking and are able to laugh at that style of filmmaking, then you'll really get a kick out of it. If you like your films to be conventionally well made and for humour to be jokes and clear visual gags like someone falling downstairs, then this might not be for you. This is a very trippy experience. A critique I could have for it is that it's quite exhausting, and by the end you're sort of like, I think I've had enough. Even though it's an hour and a half, your senses have just been assaulted for an hour and a half. And sort of similarly to the Nightingale, you're sort of just waiting for the next horror thing to happen. You're waiting for the next crazy thing to happen. And after a while, you're sort of checking out because it's just a lot to take in. And it does build to this crazy finale. But the film can become quite tiresome because you're just watching one bad shit crazy thing after the other. And so you're not really invested much. You're sort of just watching everything being thrown at the fan, basically. And so it's really entertaining in that regard, but also that's going to turn off a lot of people to this film, and some people are just going to find it too much. I did, on the whole, really enjoy it though, because that sort of crazy, frantic, tongue-in-cheek style of horror filmmaking, I really enjoy. There we go. Episode 1 of Horror Highlights. Don't know how long this video is going to be because I haven't edited it, but I've tried to talk quickly and get my thoughts out a bit better than before, where I meander and take about 20 minutes to review a film. Copious amounts of coffee helped with that. And so, yeah, little thoughts on horror films. Hope you enjoyed, and check these horror films out if you think they're up your alley.